Imagine you are a soldier about to participate in the bloodiest day in American history. Now imagine you're a soldier with no training and we're about to participate in the bloodiest day in American history. Well, that's what the men of the 16th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry would have to face on September 17th of 1862. They were thrown into the fire, quite literally. How could we be expected to survive? Well, we're going to walk in the footsteps of the 16th Connecticut and learn a little bit about their struggles here at Antietam. The 16th Connecticut was formed in Hartford County, Connecticut, and was mustered into service August 24th of 1862. They entered service just 3 weeks before the Battle of Antietam. At Antietam, the 16th Connecticut Infantry was commanded by Colonel Francis Beach and was part of Colonel Edward Harlan's brigade. The 16th would enter Antietam with little to no military training when it was thrown into the fight. They had loaded their muskets for the first time the day before the battle. So we are in the general area of what is called Snavely's Ford. Now, if you recall in the last video, Isaac Rodman's division, which was part of the 9th Corps, was sent on the east side of the Antietam Creek along this general direction, and they were tasked with trying to find an alternative route around the Confederate defenses here. And we mentioned how the 9th New York was one of the first regiments to cross Snavely's Ford, and they made contact with the 50th Georgia in this general area. Now, also part of Isaac Rodman's division was Harlan's brigade, which consisted of the 16th Connecticut, the 8th Connecticut, and the 4th Rhode Island. So the 16th Connecticut would make their way across this ford. Now, George Merriman of the 16th Connecticut would state, "The river was nearly to our waist." Some other soldiers stated that the water was chest deep. Holding their rifles above their heads, they crossed the ford in this general location. So again, we touched on how the 9th New York crossed with their rifles and cartridge boxes above their heads. Well, it was no different for the 16th. Now, the 16th would cross this general location and continue to form line of battle near what would be called the 40-acre cornfield. And they were initially sent there around 3 p.m. to support a battery, and they would line up on the extreme left flank of the Union Army, and that's where we're headed next. So we are making our way up from Snavely's Ford, which is behind me. 16th Connecticut, we crossed Snavely's Ford with the rest of our brigade, and let's think about what would be going through a soldier's mind. Remember, we mustered into the Army less than 3 weeks ago, and we spent most of that time marching to DC and then from DC to here. Think about what's going through the mind of these soldiers here marching into battle. You hear the cannons, you hear the crack of musketry in the distance. There are reports that the 16th Connecticut didn't even learn how to load and fire their muskets until the day prior to the Battle of Antietam, September 16th of 1862. They handed you a musket and taught you how to load it once or twice. Now we're about to form up for one final large Union attack with the rest of the 9th Corps. Think about what's going through the minds of a soldier as we're walking to the battle. Those cracks of musketry and the booming of cannons are getting louder and louder. I feel like the 16th Connecticut was kind of set up to fail here, especially being on the extreme left flank of the Union Army. Okay, so we've moved, so let's reorient ourselves. We are looking south, and that is where Snavely's Ford is, and that is where Isaac Rodman's division would cross, and they'd make their way up to this general location. Now, looking east, you can't see it from here, that is the general location of Burnside's Bridge. Now, around 1 p.m., you had Union forces crossing Snavely Ford. You had the 51st Pennsylvania and the 51st New York crossing Burnside's Bridge. The Confederate forces would have began pulling back in this general location, and you can see Sharpsburg in the distance here. Now, this area before us is where the 16th Connecticut and the rest of Harlan's brigade would have been positioned at around 3 p.m. And they would have made up the extreme left flank of the Union Army here. And Burnside's corps would have formed along this line here, stretching nearly a mile wide, 9,000 strong, and they were prepping for a final attack on the Confederate position, which was positioned on some high ground just east of Sharpsburg. And Confederate artillery saw these Union positions, and they were opening up on these Union infantry here. So the men of the 16th Connecticut and the 4th Rhode Island would be instructed to lay down. Now, you can see the 16th Connecticut monument right here, and the men of the 16th Connecticut and the 4th Rhode Island were instructed to lay down and take cover. Well, making up the right flank of Harlan's brigade was the 8th Connecticut. Now, they were positioned just outside of the corn. So that is our line of battle at around 3 p.m. Now, around 4 p.m., the Union 9th Corps would begin their assault, and you would have had a mile-wide, long line of infantry headed towards Sharpsburg, which is in this general direction. Now, I just wanted to give you another visual here. Again, here's Harlan's brigade, 16th Connecticut, 8th Connecticut, and the 4th Rhode Island would have been positioned directly in front of us here. Making up their right flank, you had Harrison Fairchild's brigade, which contained the 9th New York, which we covered in a previous video, and you can see our location here. So just before us, the 16th Connecticut would have been positioned in the 40-acre cornfield, and that's where we're headed next. We're going to head right to their monument right here. So as you can see now, we're at the location of the 16th Connecticut marker, and we were just right here looking in our general direction at you on the camera. So again, at 3 p.m., the Union line of battle of the 9th Corps would have stretched along a mile in this location, and around 4 p.m. the order was given for this line of Union infantry to start advancing towards Sharpsburg in this direction. Now, anchoring the right of Harlan's brigade was the 8th Connecticut. Now remember, they were just outside of the corn. And in this general area, of course, the 16th Connecticut, we were in the corn, and in this general area, you had the 4th Rhode Island, who was also in the corn. Now, Confederate artillery was hammering this position, so the 16th Connecticut was instructed to lay down along with the 4th Rhode Island. Now, when the order was given to attack, the 8th Connecticut began advancing towards their objective. Well, because the men were laying down in chest-high corn, they either didn't hear that order, and they also didn't see the 8th advancing. So the 16th Connecticut and the 4th Rhode Island remain in this position. And one thing that is sticking out to me right now is the terrain here. So like we touched on, this was a cornfield. And when I think of a cornfield, I think of a nice flat field with nice rows of corn. But look at this terrain here. Look how it dips and rises all in this direction here. That's something that you don't get when you read a book or watch a documentary. When you physically come to the battlefields, this is what you can see is the terrain, especially in the winter when there's less foliage. That's one thing that's sticking out to me here. Now, Isaac Rodman himself saw this gap forming between the 16th Connecticut and the 8th Connecticut, who was advancing in this general direction. He personally rode over to this area, rode up to Colonel Francis Beach, and had some colorful language exchange with the colonel and the division commander. And he was simply stating, like, hey, you need to get your men moving in this direction. We have a gap being created in the lines, and as that conversation was taking place, Rodman noticed some movement on the left flank here. And that movement was A.P. Hill's Light Division taking the field, fresh off their victory at Harper's Ferry, which is 17 miles away. Now, upon that victory, those Confederate forces hustled to this location because Lee was in dire need of reinforcements. He only had a couple thousand Confederate forces defending this portion of the battlefield, and the entire 9th Corps, 9,000 strong, was sweeping across this field here. So, just in the nick of time, 2,000 men of A.P. Hill's Light Division were taking the field. And in this location, you had Maxcy Gregg's South Carolinians, comprising of the 1st, 12th, 13th, and 14th South Carolina. And in this direction, you had James Archer's Mixed Brigade advancing towards us on the camera here. And you also had a brigade of North Carolinians advancing across the field, attempting to cut off the 8th Connecticut and the 9th New York in this direction here. So now the 16th Connecticut was being hit on their flank, and we already touched on how they had little to no training. So imagine being a soldier in this regiment, having an experienced force on your flank pouring hot lead into your ranks, and you have no idea how to perform maneuvers, much less these maneuvers being performed under fire here. All right, so obviously there's no corn here, but let's use our imaginations a little bit, all right? We're hunkering down. We were ordered to lay down. So hopefully some of that Confederate artillery coming from this area wouldn't strike us. We're hunkered down in the corn. The 8th Connecticut on our right flank, they've already advanced. They were told to advance. Somehow we didn't get that order. Now, all of a sudden, we're told to come to our feet, and there's a Confederate force of experienced South Carolinians on our flank, and they begin pouring devastating volleys into our ranks. We're already scared. I have no idea how to fire my musket. I fired it once yesterday. This is the situation that these men were in. And I'm already a little out of breath just by hiking around with a backpack. So imagine your adrenaline going, and you have no training, and you find yourself in the bloodiest single day in American military history. Man. Now, despite the 16th inexperience, they were able to start returning some fire from this location, and they actually inflicted some heavy casualties on the 1st and 12th South Carolina, who reformed and charged this location a handful of times. And eventually, between the fire to their front and the fire to their flank, the 16th Connecticut and the 4th Rhode Island began to falter here, and they began to pull back in this general location. Now, you see that monument in the distance there. That is a monument to a handful of Ohio regiments who tried to stem the tide here to no avail. But we are in the location where the 16th Connecticut experienced their baptism of fire here. And I don't know if you can blame them for the ensuing fight or lack thereof that this turned into, but I feel like, given the circumstances, they did their best, and they were put in a pretty awful predicament here, especially being on the flank of the entire Union Army at this point in the battle. You probably want your more inexperienced regiments in the center of the line. So that's something to think about here. Now you can just imagine the confusion that was taking place on this field just behind me on the camera here. And there's even an account of a 16th Connecticut Infantry officer coming up to Colonel Beach asking, "What do you want me to do?" These men were panicking. And Colonel Beach simply replied, "I want my men to face the enemy." So even though this area was riddled with confusion, men are beginning to drop. Men don't know how to perform their maneuvers under fire because they never practiced them. Colonel Francis Beach was trying to organize some resistance to slow down the Confederate advance that was taking place on our left flank here.
Orders were given which few of the men understood, for we were almost wholly ignorant of regimental movements. Unknown soldier, 16th Connecticut.
One of the most terrific volleys of musketry that I think was ever poured into a regiment. Our men fell on every side. Private Robert Kellogg, 16th Connecticut Infantry.
We delivered a destructive volley into it before our presence seemed to be realized. Lieutenant Colonel James Perrin, 1st South Carolina Rifles.
So I've changed locations. Straight ahead is the 16th Connecticut Monument. That is where they were positioned, and the 4th Rhode Island was in this general area. We are on Branch Avenue, and this location offers a great view as to where the 16th was and what they were facing. So you had Confederate forces advancing on the flank here, engaging the 16th and the 4th Rhode Island from that location. The 8th Connecticut advanced in this general location, so there was a natural gap created between the 8th and the 16th. And down in that fishbowl, at least from this location, is the 16th. Now keep in mind this was a cornfield at the time of the battle, and corn didn't grow as tall then, but remember, people weren't as tall then either. So it was between 4 and 5 feet, chest high to shoulder high. And so you had the 16th Connecticut fighting for their lives, essentially, in that cornfield here. But you can just kind of see if Confederate forces took up position on this elevated ground here, they can essentially just pour volleys into the men of the 16th Connecticut and the 4th Rhode Island. So that is the Confederate perspective here on the Union left flank. So I worked my way back down east of the 16th Connecticut monument that you're seeing before us here. And like we touched on, we had Confederate forces on our left flank. 4th Rhode Island would have been in this direction as well. You had Confederate forces beyond the monument, which would have been west. And they were pouring deadly volleys into the 16th Connecticut. Now, one of those victims to the volleys was Captain Samuel Brown of Company D, and he was one of 4 captains killed in this brief but intense firefight with the 16th Connecticut.
Samuel Brown was born in Massachusetts and was 26 years old when he enlisted in the Union Army. Before the war, Brown graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine, which was the same college that produced the famed Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Like Chamberlain, Brown was a school teacher. Brown would quickly gain the respect of his men leading up to Antietam. One account states that Brown was urging his men to fight, saying, "Charge bayonets and come on, boys." Moments later, a Confederate volley struck numerous members of Company D.
Now, I got to give credit to John Banks' Civil War blog, because without his website, I would have never known about this story. And because of his research and the map made by Private William Relier, they were able to find the general location of Captain Samuel Brown's body. And you have the monument here. In the days following the Battle of Antietam here, Brown's body was located in this general area. And his body would have been stripped of clothing. No doubt Confederate forces came to this area, took what they needed. Remember, they didn't really have the industrial might of the Union, so they would have found his body. Now, Captain Samuel Brown was struck 3 times by Confederate volleys in the neck, hip, and arm, and he would crawl to this location where he would have his last moments in this general area. Now, within a few minutes, the fight in this portion of the battlefield would end. The 16th Connecticut would pull back. They've done everything they could up until this point, and they'd pull back east towards the Burnside Bridge, and where they essentially started in the morning of September 17th of 1862. Now, Harlan would attempt to rally what was left of his brigade, and unfortunately for the 16th Connecticut, their misfortune would not end here at Antietam. Exactly 19 months later, in 1864, at the Battle of Plymouth in North Carolina, the entire regiment was captured with the exception of Company H, and another 154 members of the 16th Connecticut would perish in Andersonville prison before the end of the war. Now, the 16th story isn't filled with romantic tales of heroism and bravery, but their sacrifice and their actions here at Antietam still deserve to be remembered, because they fought and suffered here just like everybody else. And I hope this video sheds some light on their story, even though it may not be as romantic as some of the other stories here at Antietam.